The Middle East is the birthplace of multiple societies, including arguably Western civilization as a whole. But just what exactly constitutes this region that we today refer to as the Middle East? If there's anything I learned from my comment section, it's not to refer to people from the region of North Africa as Middle Easterners, and the people of North Africa are definitely a very proud group of people, and many of them see their inclusion into the Middle East or the Arab world as an erasure of their history and identity, as they did not always speak Arabic or practice the Islamic faith. And instead, many North Africans wish to forge their own identity as one of the most historically and culturally relevant regions on Earth, which is totally understandable. Some have criticized the use of the phrase Middle East, but it always made sense to me that it was called this, since it's in the middle of the Afro-Eurasian supercontinent, surrounded on all sides by African, European, and Asian cultures, and it's east of the Western world. But the actual etymology traces back to when the Levant was known as the Near East, Iraq and Persia were known as the Middle East, and China and Southeast Asia was known as the Far East, relative to Europe, that is. Besides, Middle East as a phrase has a bit of a different meaning to it than West Asia, which is often used with it interchangeably, but the Middle East as a term often includes the entire country of Egypt, the bulk of which is in Africa, and the term West Asia usually includes the former Soviet republics of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. But just as with most regions defined by man, they don't nearly express the nuance and complexity of their situations. But why is it that the nations of West Asia and North Africa are so often lumped together haphazardly by Westerners and others around the world, and often this greater geocultural region is expanded to include other places as well? Is India a part of the greater Middle East? Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Greece? Cases have been made for all of these countries, and in today's video I'm going to explain some of the similarities between them from a cultural, religious, linguistic, and genetic viewpoint, as well as some of the vast differences that make all of them unique as well. By watching my video I released last year over the historical classification used by anthropologists known as the Caucasian race, you'd know that actually, yes, most of the people groups that have historically been considered Caucasian or Caucasoid, including Somalis, Sri Lankans, Swedes, and Syrians, do, to varying degrees of course, share a certain underlying genetic strain that traces back tens of thousands of years from when humans first left Africa. As non-African humans forked out into the Eurasian continent, they quickly diverged into eastern and western branches, and although this is complicated by levels of intermixing over the generations, the people of the western half and eastern half of the continent are divided between these two ancient gene pools. Southern Eurasia and Oceania are another case entirely, which is what I and many others refer to as Western and Eastern Eurasian DNA respectively, which I find much more pleasant to use rather than Caucasoid or Mongoloid. The bulk of the North African gene pool can be traced back to series of migrations, not from neighboring sub-Saharan Africa as one might expect, but rather from Southwest Asia from around 20 to 30,000 years ago. But it's actually a bit more complicated than this, since there's also been more recent genetic diffusion from sub-Saharan Africa and Europe, with varying groups having varying differences in genetic components. For instance, in Egypt, the population was historically extremely similar to that found in the neighboring Levant or Arabia, but due to migration from the Nilo-Saharan inhabited Sudan region and the Horn of Africa, as well as the widespread use of slaves from the south, today most Egyptians have anywhere from 10 to 20% sub-Saharan African DNA, increasing the further south you go, mostly of Nilo-Saharan origin. Most indigenous people of the Maghreb to the west also have similar amounts of sub-Saharan DNA. However, this is mostly of West African rather than East African extraction, which makes sense considering their geography. And keep in mind that North Africa was one of the most significant historical trading centers for much of Europe, with there also being a diffusion of European DNA into the North African populace as well, which is also partially explained by the capture of Southern and Eastern Europeans for use as slaves during the Islamic era. African DNA is also found at significant rates in West Asia, albeit to a lesser degree, especially in Yemen, with the African proportion rivaling or even equaling that of Egypt, being the highest of any country in Asia, as well as in Saudi Arabia, the Persian Gulf, Iraq, the Levant, normally being higher among Muslims than Christians in this region, and even has been found in trace amounts in Pakistan and India. However, due to other historical events, it's also not uncommon to find Eastern Eurasian DNA present in the greater Middle Eastern region as well, with Turkey being an obvious example of this, and a significant number of Iranians also have ancestry from the Turco-Mongol invasions, with this radiating out into North Africa through intermarriage with the Turks during Ottoman colonization. The Caucasus region is a bit difficult to classify as either the Middle East or Europe, since culturally they lean much more heavily towards the former, but genetically they actually lie mostly in between Northwest and Southwest Eurasia. Big shocker considering that's where their geographic placement is as well. Many Pakistanis or Afghans, even excluding Indo-Aryan speakers, still have a certain degree of indigenous South Asian DNA, and this extends to the rest of the greater Middle East through the Romani and Domari peoples, known in the West as Gypsies. The Rom and Dom are now believed to have originated from low-caste North Indians who started their migration west over 1,000 years ago, intermixing with the surrounding populations to varying degrees. There are anywhere from 1 to 10 million Gypsies in the Middle East and North Africa today, with their highest numbers in Turkey, Egypt, and Iran, where they have largely integrated into the local populations. This is intriguing and a bit ironic because South Asians themselves are partially descended from an ancient migration wave out of the Middle East, with the Dravidians believed to have originated from what is now Iran, with nearly 40% of the entire South Asian gene pool deriving from West Asia, with the rest being indigenous South Asian or coming from other migration waves. Similarly, in Central Asia, the population was formerly made up of people groups who were very similar to those found in the Middle East. However, centuries of colonization by Turks and Mongols has radically altered the DNA of this region, with less than a third of the Central Asian gene pool being of Southwest Eurasian origin, although this increases in groups like the Uzbeks or Turkmen. I already discussed these past couple regions in my video over mixed race people worldwide, as technically the Horn of Africa and Sudan is mixed between the indigenous East African Nilotes and various waves of migration from Southwest Asia, the oldest of which dates back to nearly 20,000 years ago, although the Habesha from Eritrea and Ethiopia are from a more recent group from southern Arabia. For more recent cases of Southwest Eurasian DNA outside of its main core region, we can find that, of course, due to the millennia of trade, migration, and intermixing with Europe, many Southern European groups and even Northern European groups have varying rates of admixture, particularly in Greece and the rest of the Balkans, as well as Iberia, which were both ruled by Islamic powers for centuries, that being the Ottomans and Moors respectively. Interestingly, the majority of Latin Americans also have small to moderate amounts of Southwest Eurasian admixture, partially as an extension of that found in Iberia, with the largest sources being Sephardi Jews and Moors who were expelled from Spain, but also due to a large number of Levantine Arabs who migrated there after independence. The Swahili coast is known to have been a trading hub between the Middle East and East Africa, with many Zanzibaris, Comorians, and other Swahili speakers having Arab and or Persian ancestry, and Arab traders even made it as far as Southeast Asia, with the number of Indonesians, Malaysians, and Filipinos with some degree of Arab or Persian ancestry from this era being in the millions. Now, there has also been significant migration between West Asia and North Africa, which resulted in dramatic linguistic, cultural, and religious changes, as during the Islamic expansion, a large number of Arabs swept through Egypt and the Maghreb, very quickly becoming the dominant class in these regions and intermarrying with the local women. As to what degree this changed the genome is unclear, but it is certainly highest in Egypt, with a plurality of the Egyptian Muslim genome being traced back to Arabia, which is not true for Egyptian Christians. However, the difference in ancestry between Arabic and Berber-speaking Maghrebis is not nearly as extreme, with the two groups sharing 75 to 90% of their DNA, which is why they are often grouped together from an ethnic and cultural viewpoint as simply Arab-Berbers. So perhaps a neighboring Greek and Turk might be genetically closer than a Turk and an Egyptian, or a Moroccan and Spaniard might be closer than a Moroccan and Pakistani, and guess what? A Palestinian Arab and Palestinian Jew are definitely closer than a Palestinian and an Iraqi or Saudi. However, when we're talking about genetic components, distance, and clustering, it becomes clear that there is a definite continuum between those in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as an underlying substratum with South Central Asia and the Horn of Africa to a lesser extent. As to why there is no significant Middle Eastern racial identity in the same way there is for Europeans, Africans, Amerindians, or even Latinos and South Asians, who, by the way, have far more genetic diversity than different Middle Eastern groups, is because historically in these regions, religion, culture, and national identity were far more important to most of the population than skin color or ancestry, for the most part. There are a few exceptions to this in the modern day, such as Middle Eastern enclaves forming in the United States, especially in places like New Jersey, mostly Turkish and Palestinian, Michigan, mostly Yemeni and Assyrian, and Southern California, mostly Armenians and Persians. However, whether this grouping is due to some greater sense of cultural belonging, shared genetics or heritage, or simply out of convenience, well, I don't know. So, the people of the Middle East and North Africa certainly do share a lot of similarities when it comes to culture, religion, and genetics, but there are still major differences. And between the two of them, Southwest Eurasian DNA and influence has spread all across the globe. Although being in the middle of the old world, they've been significantly impacted by many disparate cultures as well. So please let me know your thoughts on the people of West Asia and North Africa and the rest of the greater Middle East. And for today's poll, tell me where you think they've had the most interesting impact that you'd like to learn more about. As always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.